pertinent. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. You are live on to DW Africa, and once more we are here to talk about pertinent issues plaguing the African continent. Today is about politics, and this time around we are taking you to Central Africa, precisely Cameroon, where for close to 4 years now, an armed conflict has ripped the country's English-speaking regions apart. Thousands have died, and at least 1 million people displaced within and out of the country. Now, Cameroon is not just grappling with this armed conflict, there is also the deadly coronavirus pandemic. Cameroon is now having one of Africa's highest coronavirus cases. It is counting more than 12,000 people who are so far being infected by this virus and over 300 deaths. The latest news is that a group of world leaders, including, that is 15 of them, including Nobel Peace Prize winners and former heads of states, as well as some Cameroonians, are now calling for a humanitarian ceasefire to be able to permit health workers go about the activities in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon normally. Is that going to be possible? It should be noted that this release was made public today, and today one of the signatories of this call for ceasefire is Dr. Simon Adans. He's going to be speaking to DW. Dr. Simon, good day. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
We should be thanking you for coming and for your time as well. Today is Monday, the first day of the week, and for you to give us that time is very, very precious. Dr. Simon, you are actually the Executive Director of the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect. You have done a lot on the Rwandan genocide as well as genocide across the world in conflict-hit areas across the globe. Now, why did you and other signatories to this call for ceasefire in Cameroon decide to come up with this initiative just now, when this conflict is almost 4 years old today?
No, that's a good point. I mean, the question of why now, I think, is something that some people might be asking. But I think there's many people in the world right now who don't know about Cameroon. It's one of the great neglected conflicts, I think, of our times. And so far, while people in West Africa, people obviously in Cameroon are very aware of the suffering and the hardship that's been endured for such a long time, I think it's to the discredit of the UN Security Council that it has not formally addressed the conflict there, and it has not really been covered widely in the media. And so myself and the other signatories obviously signed this declaration because we want to see more international attention brought to what is one of the most devastating conflicts affecting Western Africa at the moment.
Now, you're talking about devastating conflict in Cameroon. Many organizations as well as opposition leaders in Cameroon have actually warned about a possible genocide in Cameroon's English-speaking regions. As someone who has been doing a lot in that domain, are there some elements of genocide in this conflict in Cameroon?
Well, here's what's absolutely clear. There is an identity-based conflict happening in the Anglophone areas of Cameroon. And because of that identity-based conflict, villages are being burnt down. Anglophone villages are being burnt down because they're full of Anglophone speakers. We see definitely what I would consider to be mass atrocity crimes, including crimes that could rise to the level of crimes against humanity under international law. I hope we're not in a pre-genocidal situation, but certainly I think the targeting of anybody on the basis of their identity, of their language, of how the community to which they belong is something we should be extremely concerned about, and that's what we see in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon.
What about the atrocities on the ground? You are actually challenging the warring actors in this conflict, the security forces, the government security forces and the separatists, to make way for health officials so that they can be able, as well as humanitarian authorities, so that they can be able to carry out the activities normally. Tell us how bad the situation is for health workers and also humanitarian aids.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation. Well, let's keep in mind that in the Anglophone regions of Cameroon, there are already more than 500,000 people who have been displaced, who have been forced to flee their homes. Many of those people, thousands upon thousands of those people, are living in the bush, are living in other people's homes, staying in other villages to try and get support. And it is not an environment in which health services can operate in any free and open kind of way. There's only, as far as I know, one functioning hospital in part of the region. People will not go to it because of they're perceived as being either pro-government or anti-government and could get in trouble one way or another. You have government forces, of course, targeting people if they think that they're Anglophone speakers. You also have non-state armed groups, the separatists, who are also targeting people. And in all of that, it's humanitarian workers who are kind of between the hammer and the anvil, keeping in mind that we are in the middle of a global pandemic and that Cameroon is one of the worst affected countries in West Africa. So that's exactly why we're calling for a humanitarian ceasefire so that at the very least, the long-suffering people of Cameroon, especially in those Anglophone areas, can get the medical assistance that they need.
Dr. Simon Adams, it's not like I'm neglecting the health impact of the coronavirus pandemic, but you seem to be more worried about the impact of this pandemic on the people than the crisis itself, because I have been speaking to many people in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. They are making me to understand that the impact of this war, the violence, the frustration on the people is much more bigger than the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on them. Why not prioritize on ending this conflict than calling for ceasefire just for health reasons? Like I said, I'm not neglecting the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, well, let me be absolutely clear. You know, my organization has followed the situation in Cameroon since this crisis sort of broke out. We have been calling the whole time for a fundamental resolution of this conflict. That means negotiations between the government and separatists. That means a genuine national dialogue about the future of the country. It means all kinds of protections that need to be put in place to protect civilians, particularly in the Anglophone regions where there has been so much fighting, so much displacement, and atrocities committed. We've been saying that for a very long time. I guess what we're seeing now is that on top of all that, we now have the added ingredient of the pandemic. And that's why we're more concerned, I guess, than ever about the health, safety, and welfare of people in that part of the world. And I think precisely because the pandemic has brought so much attention to some conflicts in the world, with the UN Secretary General calling for a global ceasefire, it seems like now, at least, even if Anglophone separatists and the government can't agree on everything or even anything at the moment, there surely should be one thing that they can agree upon, which is that they must put the health and safety of people in the country first. So that's why we're calling for the ceasefire now.
And hoping that from this health crisis, we might be heading to an end to the conflict, which seemed to be so far-fetched. 2 months ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations actually called for this same ceasefire that you and other world leaders, civil society actors in Cameroon and beyond, as well as Nobel Peace Prize winners have also called for. In this global call for peace and justice in Cameroon are 4 key actors. The UN Secretary General, like I said, the UN rather, you're challenging them to ensure that there is ceasefire in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. The UN has that power to change things and pressure for mediation in this conflict in the northwest and the southwest regions of Cameroon. Why is it failing to make sure it happens?
Yeah, I think the UN Security Council definitely has the power to do so, and it has not done so. I mean, it has discussed Cameroon in a very kind of oblique and abstract way a couple of times. It has never had it on its agenda of the Security Council. It has never formally met to discuss the conflict in Cameroon, despite the thousands of lives that have been lost, despite the burning of villages, despite the fact that more than 500,000 people are displaced. And I think that is a great tragedy and a great failing on behalf of the UN Security Council. And so I can fully understand why people in Cameroon and people around the world would be looking at that Security Council with frustration and anger, and why it has neglected this conflict for too long. So it's another reason why I decided to sign this particular declaration, because I don't see this as the final step. I see this as the first step. Let's at least get the guns to drop in the context of this pandemic. Then that can be the first step. Let's get more attention on what's actually happening in Cameroon. And then maybe we can push to the next step, which is a more lasting resolution to the conflict and an end to atrocities that have taken place there now for over 3 years. And ultimately, I think there has to be accountability for atrocities that have taken place in Cameroon as well.
And another key actor is the African Union. The AU chair visited Cameroon, held talks with the president of the Republic of Cameroon, Paul Biya, and promised to do something about the situation. But up to now, nothing has changed. Several months back, or several months after, so many people continue to die. More and more people get to be displaced in these conflicted regions of Cameroon. Why is this crisis not a matter of urgency at the level of the AU?
I mean, I can't answer that question because I think it should be, and because I share your frustration. Look, the AU was supposed to end the politics of indifference when it comes to the suffering of African people on the African continent. And in fact, Article 4H of the Constitution, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, says that the members of the African Union should never be indifferent or inactive when people face crimes against humanity, when people face atrocities on the African continent. And yet that's exactly what we see in Cameroon. So I think it should certainly be a priority of the African Union. And I regret that I feel that up to this point, the African Union has decided to sort of look the other way and turn a blind eye to the situation and just cross their fingers and hope that it improves. It has not improved. And in fact, over the last 3 years, it has got consistently worse.
Yeah, we've just talked about the AU and also the UN. They seem to be working together because just a few days ago, we saw 54 African countries actually calling for racism to end in the world and police brutality. And that was easily taken up by the United Nations Humanitarian Committee, and they actually deliberated on this. When is this issue in Cameroon, what's going on, the socio-political crisis, supposed to get to the level of the UN? Is it when it's already at the tipping point, or what? Why is it delaying? Because it was so easy to accept what African Union African leaders were talking about, racism and police brutality in the world. Why is that of Cameroon and other conflicted areas in Africa delaying to be discussed at the level of the UN?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's taken a very, very, very long time for the United Nations and for the Human Rights Council to discuss the issue of police brutality and racism in the United States and elsewhere. Many people would say it's taken them far too long to take up that issue. And it was only because of the extraordinary Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen in the United States and many other parts of the world that there was significant pressure on international bodies to take up that question. The question of why the UN has not more widely discussed the Cameroon conflict, I guess, comes back to this whole issue of alliances, of political relationship, of the president of Cameroon's relationship with other world leaders, and the fact that Cameroon has consistently argued that this is a sovereign question, that it's dealing with the situation internally. Well, I certainly come from a different tradition. I come from a tradition that believes in universal human rights. I come from a tradition that says that sovereignty must entail responsibility, and that the greatest responsibility that any leader can have to their own people is to protect them from mass atrocity crimes.
Now,
so certainly I would be one of those who wants to see it more widely discussed, who believes that it should have been discussed 3 years ago. But we're doing all we can to raise our voices as loud as we can.
Yeah, and talking about discussion, it's almost impossible if the key actors are not involved, the government of Cameroon and also the separatists. Why is the government proving who is being stubborn? And what can be done to bring the two actors on the negotiating table?
I mean, that's where I think international pressure is absolutely crucial, because what is clear is that, first of all, when we talk about the Anglophone separatists, we're not talking about a single amorphous entity. We're talking about a number of different groups with varying perspectives on the conflict and varying demands, although one central demand, I guess, that they share. When it comes to the government, this is a government that doesn't feel the pressure at the moment of the international community, does not feel the pressure of the moral conscience of the world. And so it is able to kind of fend off that international attention while continuing to make some mealy-mouthed statements about how it's going to, hold a dialogue or whatever, but not actually changing the situation on the ground. So from my perspective, the more international pressure we have, the more that we can show that there is a group of world leaders, that there are a group of states, that there are a group of multilateral bodies that are pressuring the government to actually move beyond words into real action is what's going to make all the difference in the world.
So what kind of negotiation or mediation is needed in this conflict? What is your ideal negotiation in this conflict?
Well, I mean, I think that's ultimately a question for the protagonists of this conflict, whether that be the government or whether that be the Anglophone separatists. But I think that ultimately what we have seen is there hasn't been any kind of real and substantive negotiations between them. Certainly, my own background, whether that be in the conflict in South Africa or in East Timor or in Northern Ireland, where I was sort of involved to different degrees in those situations, is that a ceasefire has been an essential part of moving from an armed to an unarmed phase, and then from not talking to talking as part of a ongoing process of trying to resolve the conflict. But it's clear that there are fundamental issues that need to be resolved in Cameroon in order to stop the fighting in the long term.
Now, one final question. You said they should drop their weapons. When they do that, the warring parties, what next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is, again, something where we can see the international community could potentially, play a role. There's certainly no trust on behalf of either side. It's not like the government trusts the armed separatists at all, and that feeling is reciprocated in spades on behalf of the armed separatists. I'm sure that they have no desire to lay down their weapons and put themselves into the hands of government forces. So I guess the question would be, if the government really wanted to really resolve this conflict and to do so, then it should reach out to international partners, whether that be the UN or whether that be the AU or whether that be other states in the region, and try to get somebody as a neutral broker to try and make sure that all sides are safe.
But do you think a different leadership in Cameroon could make that happen? If a current government for 4 years cannot resolve a conflict, are you positive? Are you optimistic?
Look, I think that is a question for the Cameroonian people. But certainly they've had a single man as the president for an awful long time. And so I guess that question is not just a question of the last 4 years. It's a question of what does Cameroon's political destiny look like? But whether we like it or not, he is currently, and I have no opinion on the matter. I'm not Cameroonian myself, but he is the president of the republic. But certainly I think what is lacking at the moment is a sense of the moment, of seizing the moment, and a sense of political vision about how to build a better Cameroon and to deal with the situation in the Anglophone regions. At the moment, that is only seen to be as a question of bayonets and bullets, and that is not going to solve this problem. So there's certainly a different kind of political vision that is required in Cameroon.
Dr. Simon Adams, thank you so much. Thank you.